In 1924, the dense rainforests of the Belgian Congo harbored secrets darker than the canopy itself. Along the muddy banks of the Congo River, where the sound of rushing water masked countless screams, colonial rubber plantations operated under a system so brutal that even seasoned administrators in Léopoldville preferred not to ask too many questions. This is the story of a calculated act of vengeance that took 5 years to plan and only one night to execute. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Deep in the Mbandaka region, where morning mists clung to the forest floor like ghosts of the dispossessed, stood the Vandenbroeck Rubber Plantation. Among its steaming processing sheds and cramped worker quarters, power was measured not in the tons of latex extracted each month, but in the number of screams that echoed through the forest when Henri Vandenbroeck's hunting dogs were released to track down those who dared to flee. What happened during the rainy season of 1924 at this remote plantation would shake the very foundations of colonial authority in the region. A story of patience, meticulous planning, and the terrible price of pushing human endurance beyond all breaking points. It began with a young Mongo man named Bakari Mwanza, 8 hungry dogs, and 5 years of accumulated rage that burned hotter than the equatorial sun. The dogs at Vandenbroeck Plantation were more than mere animals. They were instruments of psychological warfare, trained from birth to track human scent through the impossible maze of the Congo rainforest. When Bakari finally fed those dogs something other than their usual scraps of bushmeat and worker rations, the act would expose the thin veneer of civilization that the colonial system claimed to represent. Some acts of justice are so precisely calculated that they take years to fully understand. When the truth about what happened at the Vandenbroeck Plantation finally emerged through whispered testimonies and coded messages sent along ancient river trading routes, it was already too late for everyone involved. The colonial authorities had lost more than just 2 prominent plantation managers. They had lost the illusion that their system of control was unbreakable. The morning of March 15, 1924, began like any other at the Vandenbroeck Rubber Plantation, with the sharp blast of Henri Vandenbroeck's whistle cutting through the humid air at precisely 5 o'clock. The sound echoed across the compound, bouncing off the corrugated metal roofs of the processing sheds before disappearing into the wall of green that surrounded the plantation on all sides. In the worker quarters, 45 men and women emerged from their bamboo and mud brick structures, their movements sluggish from exhaustion and malnutrition, but quickened by the knowledge that tardiness would bring swift and brutal punishment. Bakari Mwanza was already awake, as he had been for the past hour, lying on his thin mat and listening to the sounds of the forest awakening around him. At 28 years old, he possessed the lean, wiry build of someone who had spent his entire adult life performing back-breaking labor under the merciless equatorial sun. His hands, permanently stained black from years of handling raw latex, moved with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that survival depended on perfect execution of routine tasks. But behind his carefully neutral expression lay eyes that burned with an intelligence that Henri Vandenbroeck had never bothered to notice. The Vandenbroeck Plantation stretched across 2,400 hectares of some of the most productive rubber-bearing forest in the entire Belgian Congo. Located 15 kilometers upriver from the trading post of La Sala, it existed in a world unto itself, connected to the outside only by the occasional river barge that carried processed latex downstream toward the colonial capital of Léopoldville. The isolation was deliberate. In places where the reach of colonial administration grew thin, men like Henri Vandenbroeck could operate according to their own interpretation of law and order. Henri Vandenbroeck himself was a man who had learned to view human beings as simply another resource to be extracted from the African landscape. At 52 years old, he had spent nearly 3 decades in the Congo, arriving as a young man full of dreams of quick wealth and returning to Belgium as a successful planter. Those dreams had been realized, but at a cost that had carved deep lines into his face and left his pale blue eyes as cold and calculating as a crocodile's. He had built his fortune on a simple principle: maximum extraction with minimum expense. The human cost of this philosophy was evident in the cemetery behind the worker quarters, where wooden crosses marked the graves of those who had not survived the quotas, the punishments, or the diseases that flourished in the cramped living conditions. The plantation's most distinctive feature was not its processing machinery or its sprawling rubber groves, but the 8 hunting dogs that lived in specially constructed stone kennels near the main house. These were not ordinary dogs, but carefully bred and trained instruments of terror. A mixture of local hunting breeds crossed with European bloodhounds that Henri had imported at considerable expense, they possessed an almost supernatural ability to track human scent through the impossible maze of the Congo rainforest. Rex, Bruno, Tissar, Max, Thor, Duke, Baron, and Chief. Their names chosen to reflect their status as extensions of colonial authority, were fed better than most of the plantation workers and received more medical attention than any African on the property. The dogs served a purpose that went far beyond their practical utility in tracking escaped workers. They were psychological weapons, their very presence a constant reminder of what awaited anyone who attempted to flee the plantation. The sound of their howling during a hunt would echo for kilometers through the forest, a chilling advertisement of the price of defiance. Henri had calculated that the fear generated by the dogs was worth much more than any amount of physical barriers or additional guards. Fear, he had learned, was the most cost-effective form of control. Bakari's relationship with these animals was complex and carefully cultivated. For the past 5 years, since the death of the previous dog keeper in 1919, he had been responsible for their daily care. Each morning, he would prepare their meals, clean their kennels, and exercise them under the watchful supervision of Léon Mercier, the plantation's French overseer. The work required him to understand the animals' behavior patterns, their individual personalities, and their responses to different commands and situations. Over time, he had become the only person able to manage them without the help of the dog's master, Henri Vandenbroeck.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
African on the plantation who could handle all 8 dogs without fear of attack. This unique position had been granted to him not out of any recognition of his abilities, but purely as a matter of practical necessity. The previous keeper, an older man named Mkomo, had been mauled to death by 3 of the dogs during a feeding incident that Henri attributed to carelessness rather than any systemic problem with using wild animals as instruments of control. Bakari had volunteered for the position, recognizing even then that proximity to the dogs might someday prove useful in ways that Henri could never imagine. The trust that Henri and his son Philippe placed in Bakari was based entirely on a fundamental misunderstanding of his character. They saw him as what colonial administrators like to call an evolved native, someone who had learned to suppress his primitive instincts in favor of reliable service to white authority. Bakari never spoke unless spoken to, never looked directly at white faces unless instructed to do so, and performed every task with the mechanical efficiency that colonials interpreted as contentment. This carefully constructed facade had taken years to perfect, each gesture and expression calculated to reinforce the perception that he was exactly what the Vandenbroecks wanted him to be. But the reality was far different. Bakari possessed a sharp intelligence that he had learned to hide from his earliest days on the plantation. He observed everything: the family's daily routines, the patterns of river traffic, the arrival and departure of colonial officials, the subtle hierarchies that existed among the white staff. He had memorized the layout of every building on the plantation, the location of every weapon, and the schedule of every guard rotation. More importantly, he had learned to read the emotional currents that flowed beneath the surface of plantation life, understanding when tensions were high, when authority figures were distracted, and when opportunities might present themselves. The morning routine at Vandenbroeck Plantation followed a pattern that had been established years earlier and rarely varied. After the whistle blast, workers would assemble in the central courtyard for the daily assignment of quotas and work details. Each person was expected to collect a minimum amount of latex each day, a quantity that Henri had calculated to be just barely achievable under optimal conditions. This meant that any delay, any equipment failure, any moment of weakness or illness would result in failure to meet the quota, which in turn would result in punishment. The punishments at Vandenbroeck Plantation were public affairs, designed not only to discipline the individual transgressor, but to reinforce the message of absolute submission for everyone else. In the center of the worker quarters stood a thick wooden post, its surface worn smooth by years of use and stained dark with blood. Léon Mercier, the overseer, was responsible for administering these punishments with a leather whip that had been specially designed for maximum pain with minimal risk of permanent disability. Henri had learned that dead workers were unprofitable, but workers who had experienced the whip were far more compliant. Bakari had witnessed hundreds of these punishment sessions over the years, forced to watch along with every other worker as men and women were stripped, tied to the post, and subjected to carefully counted lashes. Each scream, each plea for mercy, each drop of blood that splattered onto the packed earth of the courtyard was carefully cataloged in his memory, not as trauma, but as evidence. Evidence of a system so fundamentally evil that any action taken against it could be justified. The dogs were always present during punishment sessions, held on short leashes by Bakari himself as they snarled and strained toward the victim. Henri had discovered that the presence of the animals added an extra dimension of terror to the proceedings, the workers understanding that the dogs had been trained to associate the scent of blood with permission to attack. It was psychological torture refined to an art form, and Bakari was forced to be an active participant in every session. The isolation of the Vandenbroeck Plantation from colonial oversight was not accidental. Henri had deliberately chosen a location that was difficult to reach and rarely visited by government officials. The nearest Belgian administrator was based in Lisala, a day's journey by river, and his visits were infrequent and always announced well in advance. This gave Henri the freedom to operate according to his own interpretation of colonial labor regulations, which tended to prioritize productivity over humanitarian concerns. Communication with the outside world was limited to the monthly river barge that carried processed latex downstream and brought back supplies and mail. These barges were operated by colonial transport companies and staffed entirely by Europeans, with no opportunity for African workers to send messages or communicate with the outside world.
Henri had also established strict policies regarding contact between his workers and the crews of passing vessels, with severe punishments for anyone caught attempting unauthorized communication. The result was a sealed world where Henri Vandenbroeck's word was absolute law. Within the boundaries of his plantation, he possessed the power of life and death over 45 human beings, and he exercised that power with the casual indifference of someone who had long since seen Africans as fully human. The colonial system had given him this authority, but it was his own psychological makeup that had twisted it into something monstrous. Philippe Vandenbroeck, Henri's 27-year-old son, had been groomed from childhood to inherit this empire of exploitation. Unlike his father, who at least had started with some vestige of normal human empathy, Philippe had been raised in an environment where casual cruelty toward Africans was simply part of the natural order. He had never known a world where black people were treated as equals, never been exposed to any philosophy that questioned the moral foundations of colonialism. For Philippe, the plantation workers were simply talking animals, more intelligent than cattle, but fundamentally the same in terms of their moral status. The young Vandenbroeck had developed a particular fondness for the hunting dogs, spending hours training them in new techniques for tracking and intimidation. It was Philippe who had devised the practice of allowing the dogs to feed on scraps from failed escape attempts, a psychological warfare tactic that had proven remarkably effective in discouraging flight attempts. He took personal pride in the fact that his father's plantation had one of the lowest escape rates in the entire region, a statistic that he attributed to superior management rather than superior brutality. As Bakari went about his morning routine of
Preparing the dog's breakfast, mixing scraps of bushmeat with cornmeal porridge in large wooden bowls, he allowed his mind to drift to thoughts that had occupied him for the past 5 years. Thoughts of justice, of revenge, and of the precise moment when the balance of power at Vandenbroeck Plantation would finally shift. He had learned patience from years of watching and waiting, but that patience was not infinite. The rainy season was approaching, and with it would come opportunities that might not present themselves again for years. The dogs sensed his presence even before he approached their kennels, their ears perking up and tails beginning to wag in anticipation of their morning meal. They knew him as well as he knew them, had learned to trust his voice and follow his commands. What they did not know, what no one at the plantation could have imagined, was that Bakari had been planning their betrayal for longer than some of them had been alive. When the time came, when the perfect opportunity finally presented itself, these 8 hunting dogs would become the instruments of their master's destruction.
Aspect of plantation security would become the instruments of their master's destruction. This strategy required an intimate understanding of animal behavior that Bakari had developed through years of daily interaction with the pack. He knew each dog's individual personality, their food preferences, their responses to different types of commands, their relationships with each other within the pack hierarchy. More importantly, he had learned to modify their behavior through careful manipulation of their feeding schedules, their exercise routines, and their exposure to different types of stimuli. The timeline for his plan extended over several months, allowing for careful preparation and the accumulation of necessary materials without arousing suspicion. Each element had been designed to build upon the others, creating a cascade of events that would appear to be the result of natural causes or external threats rather than deliberate sabotage. The beauty of using the dogs as primary weapons was that their violent behavior would be seen as confirmation of their dangerous nature rather than evidence of human manipulation. Bakari had also identified potential allies among the plantation workforce, individuals whose personal losses and accumulated grievances made them potential recruits for carefully limited participation in his plans. Kibonge Lomami, a young man whose father had died from an infected whip wound 2 years earlier, had demonstrated the combination of rage and self-control that would be necessary for the type of action Bakari envisioned. Unlike some of the other workers who were either too broken by years of abuse or too terrified to consider resistance, Kibange retained the capacity for focused anger that could be channeled into effective action. The recruitment of accomplices required extreme caution, as the plantation's survival depended on the absolute loyalty of the workforce to the colonial system. Henri had established an elaborate network of informants among the workers, offering small privileges and protection from punishment in exchange for reports of any suspicious conversations or activities. Trust was a luxury that could prove fatal if misplaced, requiring Bakari to develop subtle methods of testing potential allies without revealing his own intentions. Communication between potential conspirators had to be conducted through coded gestures and indirect references that would be meaningless to casual observers, but would convey essential information to those who understood the context. Years of living under constant surveillance had taught the plantation workers to develop sophisticated methods of nonverbal communication, skills that Bakari now adapted for his own purposes. The psychological preparation for what he planned to do had required Bakari to fundamentally alter his relationship with concepts of mercy and moral restraint. The colonial system had systematically destroyed every person he had ever loved, had reduced him to the status of a work animal, had stolen years of his life that could never be recovered. The men he planned to kill were not innocent victims, but active participants in a system of institutionalized cruelty that had caused immeasurable suffering to countless individuals. Henri Vandenbroeck had personally ordered the deaths of dozens of workers over the years, either through direct execution for infractions or through the imposition of working conditions that amounted to slow murder. Philippe had inherited his father's capacity for cruelty and had added his own refinements to the systems of control and punishment. Léon Mercier had administered hundreds of beatings, had separated families, had destroyed lives with the casual efficiency of someone who viewed such activities as simply part of his professional responsibilities. These were not men who deserved mercy or who could be reasoned with or reformed. They were predators who had chosen to build their lives on the suffering of others, and they had forfeited any claim to moral consideration through their own actions. Bakari's plan was not motivated by blind rage or personal vendetta, but by a carefully reasoned conclusion that the removal of these individuals was not only justified, but necessary for the survival and dignity of everyone under their control. The moral framework that supported his planning drew on traditional concepts of justice that predated colonial occupation. Ideas about balance and consequence that recognized the right of victims to seek redress for systemic wrongs. In the worldview that Bakari had inherited from his ancestors, those who caused suffering were obligated to experience equivalent suffering in return, and those who refused to accept this obligation forfeited their right to protection from the community. The genius of Bakari's approach lay not in its complexity, but in its elegant simplicity. A plan so perfectly adapted to the specific circumstances of Vandenbroeck Plantation that it would appear to outside observers as nothing more than a tragic series of accidents. The hunting dogs that Henri and Philippe had trained to be instruments of terror would become the agents of their own destruction, turned against their masters through a careful manipulation of their most basic instincts. Dogs Bakari had learned through years of observation were creatures of habit and conditioning whose behavior could be modified through patient manipulation of their feeding schedules and reward systems. The 8 animals under his care had been trained to associate certain scents with permission to attack, certain sounds with the promise of food, certain situations with the expectation of violence. These same conditioning mechanisms that made them effective weapons against escaping workers could be adapted for entirely different purposes. The transformation would be gradual and subtle, implemented over a period of weeks through small changes in routine that would be invisible to casual observation but would fundamentally alter the dog's behavioral patterns. Bakari had identified specific techniques for modifying their responses to familiar stimuli, methods that would allow him to trigger aggressive behavior at precisely chosen moments while maintaining the appearance of normal animal care. The timing of his plan was designed to take advantage of the natural rhythms of plantation life and the predictable patterns of behavior that governed the Vandenbroeck family's daily routine. Henri and Philippe were creatures of rigid habit, following schedules that had been established years earlier and rarely varied except in response to external pressures. This predictability, which they viewed as a sign of efficient management, would become a fatal vulnerability when exploited by someone who understood their patterns better than they understood them themselves. The rainy season brought specific advantages that would not be available at other times of year. The heavy rains and the accompanying increase in noise would help mask any unusual sounds associated with the transformation of the dogs.
Precipitation would wash away physical evidence, the flooding would impede any investigation, and the natural isolation of the plantation would be intensified by weather conditions that made rapid communication with outside authorities nearly impossible. These environmental factors would provide crucial additional time for the elimination of witnesses and the establishment of alternative explanations for what had occurred. Bakari's method required the careful preparation of materials that could be accumulated over time without arousing suspicion. Many of the necessary components were already available within the plantation's normal operations, substances and tools that were part of the routine maintenance of equipment and facilities. Others would need to be obtained through careful manipulation of supply orders and the strategic diversion of resources from their intended purposes. The sequence of events had been planned to create a cascade effect where each action would trigger responses that would make subsequent actions appear to be natural consequences rather than deliberate interventions. The death of the first target would create conditions that would make the death of the second target seem like a predictable result of the first, while the elimination of the third target would appear to be an unfortunate accident caused by the chaos resulting from the previous deaths. Perhaps most importantly, the plan included provisions for the protection of innocent parties and the minimization of collateral damage to individuals who were not directly responsible for the plantation's crimes. Bakari had no desire to harm fellow workers or to create unnecessary suffering for people who were themselves victims of the colonial system. His targets were specifically limited to those individuals who held direct authority over the plantation's operations and who had personally participated in the brutalization of the workforce. The psychological aspect of his approach was as carefully considered as the physical components. The plan was designed to create maximum terror and confusion among the surviving members of the plantation's management structure, while simultaneously providing clear messages about the consequences of continued participation in the system of oppression. The manner of death would be symbolic as well as practical, using the victim's own weapons against them in ways that would be understood by everyone who witnessed the aftermath. The dogs themselves would serve multiple functions within the plan. They would be the primary instruments of execution, but they would also be the means of disposing of evidence and creating alternative explanations for the disappearance of the victims. Their natural behavior patterns would provide cover for human intervention, while their reputation for unpredictable violence would make their involvement in fatal attacks seem entirely plausible to any investigators. Bakari had spent months studying the individual personalities and behavioral patterns of each of the 8 dogs, identifying which animals would be most suitable for specific aspects of his plan. Rex, the largest and most aggressive of the pack, had been trained to respond to particular commands with immediate violence. Bruno and Caesar worked well as a pair and could be directed to coordinate their attacks. Max and Thor were particularly responsive to food-based conditioning and could be relied upon to follow scent trails with single-minded determination. The preparation phase would involve gradually modifying the dog's feeding schedules and reward systems to create new associations between familiar stimuli and aggressive behavior. This conditioning would be implemented so slowly and subtly that even careful observers would not notice the changes, but the cumulative effect would be to transform the animals into precisely calibrated weapons that could be activated at chosen moments. Communication with potential accomplices would be conducted through methods that had been developed over years of living under constant surveillance. The plantation workers had evolved sophisticated systems of coded gestures and indirect references that allowed for the transmission of complex information without arousing the suspicion of the management. These same techniques would now be adapted for coordinating resistance activities and ensuring that all participants understood their roles without explicit verbal communication. The timing of the plan's execution was tied to specific environmental and logistical factors that would maximize the chances of success while minimizing the risk of detection or interference. The heavy rains of the approaching season would provide natural cover for unusual activities and would create conditions that would impede any attempt to summon outside assistance. The flooding of river routes would isolate the plantation from the outside world for crucial days, during which evidence could be eliminated and alternative explanations established. Bakari had also identified specific vulnerabilities in the plantation's security arrangements that could be exploited during the implementation of his plan. The guard rotations followed predictable patterns that left certain areas unsupervised at regular intervals. The communication systems were dependent on equipment that could be easily disabled without immediate detection. The storage of weapons and supplies was concentrated in locations that could be accessed through his normal duties as dogkeeper. The plan included contingencies for various potential complications, alternative approaches that could be implemented if primary methods proved impractical or if unexpected circumstances required modifications to the original strategy. These backup plans were designed to maintain the essential elements of surprise and apparent accident while adapting to changing conditions or unforeseen obstacles. Most importantly, the approach was designed to be irreversible once initiated. Unlike plans that depended on the cooperation of large numbers of people or the maintenance of complex deceptions over extended periods, Bakari's method could be executed by a small number of trusted individuals acting independently. Once the first phase was implemented, the subsequent events would unfold according to their own logic, requiring minimal additional intervention to reach their intended conclusion. The psychological preparation for executing such a plan required Bakari to develop a form of emotional detachment that would allow him to function effectively under extreme stress while maintaining the appearance of normal behavior. Years of observing and enduring brutality had already begun this process, but the active planning of violence required a further evolution in his mental state, a transition from passive endurance to active agency that would fundamentally
alter his relationship with his own moral boundaries.
With the business community. African testimony was generally considered unreliable and was given minimal weight in legal proceedings, while European witnesses were presumed to be truthful and authoritative. Military and police forces were designed specifically to suppress African resistance while protecting European interests. The Force Publique, which served as the colony's primary security organization, was trained and equipped for the intimidation and control of African populations rather than the investigation and prosecution of crimes committed by Europeans. Local police units were subordinated to this military structure and were instructed to prioritize the maintenance of labor discipline over the protection of individual rights. The international context within which these systems operated provided additional protection for colonial exploitation through the systematic exclusion of African voices from global discussions of colonial policy. International conferences and diplomatic negotiations concerning African territories were conducted exclusively among European powers, with no representation or consideration of African interests. The League of Nations and other international organizations accepted the principle of colonial trusteeship, which legitimized European control while imposing only minimal obligations for African welfare. This broader context meant that individual acts of resistance or rebellion at places like Vandenbroeck Plantation were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of African resistance to colonial exploitation. Throughout the Congo, workers were developing strategies for survival and resistance that ranged from individual acts of sabotage to organized escape networks and armed resistance movements. The colonial authorities were increasingly concerned about the potential for coordinated uprising and were implementing ever more brutal methods of control in response to growing signs of unrest. The economic pressures that drove intensified exploitation were also creating contradictions within the colonial system itself. The destruction of African communities and the brutalization of workers were beginning to interfere with long-term productivity as death rates increased and the available labor force declined.
Some colonial administrators were beginning to question whether current methods were sustainable, but these concerns were consistently overruled by the immediate demands of investors and the competitive pressures of international markets. Part 5. Systematic Issues and Investigations Setup. The systematic brutalization that characterized life at Vandenbroeck Plantation was not the result of individual sadism or moral failure, but the logical outcome of economic and political structures that had been deliberately designed to extract maximum wealth from African resources while minimizing costs and accountability. The individual cruelties that Bakari witnessed daily were integral components of a broader system of colonial capitalism that extended throughout the Belgian Congo and beyond, connecting remote plantation compounds to financial centers in Brussels and London through chains of exploitation that remained largely invisible to the ultimate beneficiaries. The investigative framework that would eventually be applied to events at Vandenbroeck Plantation was itself a product of colonial assumptions about African capabilities and European authority. When violence occurred at remote locations, the colonial administration's primary concern was not the establishment of truth or justice, but the maintenance of order and the protection of European interests. Investigations were conducted by officials who were financially and professionally dependent on the continued profitability of plantation operations, creating inherent conflicts of interest that virtually guaranteed the suppression of evidence that might implicate the colonial system itself. Captain André Dubois, the colonial inspector who would be responsible for investigating any serious incidents at Vandenbroeck Plantation, represented the institutional mindset that shaped such proceedings. At 44 years old, Dubois had spent his entire adult career in colonial service, rising through the ranks of the administrative hierarchy by demonstrating consistent loyalty to the economic interests that drove Belgian policy in the Congo. His investigative methods had been developed through years of suppressing worker complaints and minimizing reports of abuse that might attract unwanted attention from authorities in Brussels. Dubois had earned his position through his ability to reach conclusions that supported the colonial narrative while maintaining the appearance of thorough and objective investigation. In previous cases involving plantation violence, he had consistently attributed worker deaths to accidents, disease, or the inherent dangers of tropical agriculture, while dismissing allegations of abuse as exaggerated complaints from unreliable witnesses. His reports were carefully crafted to provide legal protection for plantation owners, while offering sufficiently detailed accounts to satisfy bureaucratic requirements for documentation. The documentation systems that governed colonial administration reflected these same biases, with careful records maintained of productivity statistics and financial transactions, while systematic neglect characterized the recording of worker welfare or abuse allegations. Plantation records focused on latex output, supply deliveries, and profit margins, with minimal attention to worker health, family relationships, or community stability. When deaths occurred, they were typically recorded as simple statistics without investigation of causes or circumstances.
Authorities were structured to filter information rather than transmit it accurately. Plantation owners like Henri Vandenbroeck were responsible for preparing their own reports on local conditions, creating obvious incentives for minimizing problems and emphasizing achievements. Colonial administrators in intermediate positions had learned that reports of serious abuse or systemic problems would reflect poorly on their own performance evaluations, encouraging them to suppress or minimize disturbing information before it reached higher authorities. The broader pattern of resistance that was developing throughout the Congo created additional pressures on investigative procedures as colonial authorities became increasingly concerned about the potential for coordinated uprising against European rule. Any evidence of organized resistance or systematic planning among African workers was viewed as a threat to colonial security that required immediate and decisive response. This meant that investigations of plantation violence were conducted within a framework of presumed African guilt rather than neutral inquiry into the facts. Intelligence gathering within the colonial system relied heavily on networks of informants and collaborators who were compensated for providing information about African activities and attitudes. These networks created systematic distortions in the information available to investigators, as informants had strong incentives to provide information that would please their handlers regardless of its accuracy. The resulting intelligence reports typically emphasized African conspiracies and resistance activities while minimizing evidence of European abuse or mismanagement. The training and background of colonial investigators reflected the institutional priorities that shaped their work. Officials like Captain Dubois had received extensive instruction in the maintenance of colonial order, but minimal training in objective fact-finding or criminal investigation. Their professional advancement depended on their ability to maintain stability and protect European interests rather than their success in establishing truth or delivering justice to African victims of abuse. Medical facilities and personnel in remote areas were similarly limited by resource constraints and policy priorities that emphasized European welfare over African health. When suspicious deaths occurred, medical examinations were typically conducted by plantation physicians who were employed by the same interests they were supposed to investigate. Independent medical expertise was rarely available, and the standards applied to African deaths were far less rigorous than those used for European casualties. The geographic isolation that protected plantations from oversight also created significant challenges for any serious investigation of suspicious events. Physical evidence could be destroyed or modified long before investigators arrived. Witnesses could be intimidated or removed, and alternative explanations could be established through the manipulation of remaining evidence. The natural environment itself conspired against accurate investigation, with tropical conditions accelerating decomposition and weather patterns destroying traces that might have provided crucial information. Legal procedures governing the treatment of African testimony were designed to minimize its impact on official proceedings, with elaborate requirements for corroboration and verification that were rarely applied to European statements. African witnesses were presumed to be motivated by personal grievances or tribal loyalties that made their accounts inherently unreliable, while European testimony was treated as objective and authoritative, regardless of obvious conflicts of interest. The political pressures that shaped colonial investigations came from multiple sources, including Belgian investors who demanded protection for their financial interests, colonial administrators who were evaluated based on their ability to maintain order and productivity, and international observers who might question Belgium's fitness for colonial responsibility if evidence of systematic abuse became public. These pressures created powerful incentives for investigations to reach conclusions that protected the colonial system, while providing sufficient detail to demonstrate official concern for justice and accountability. The economic stakes involved in plantation operations were sufficiently large to justify substantial investments in covering up evidence of abuse or eliminating witnesses who might provide damaging testimony. Plantation owners had access to financial resources that far exceeded those available to African workers, allowing them to purchase loyalty, bribe officials, and manipulate evidence in ways that would be impossible for their victims to counter. The cultural assumptions that underpinned colonial society created additional barriers to accurate investigation by defining African suffering as less significant than European convenience. The deaths of African workers were viewed as regrettable but acceptable costs of economic development, while threats to European safety or property were treated as serious crimes requiring immediate and thorough response. This fundamental inequality in the value assigned to different lives shaped every aspect of how investigations were conducted and how their results were interpreted. The systematic nature of colonial exploitation meant that accurate investigation of individual incidents would necessarily expose broader patterns of abuse that extended far beyond single plantations or specific administrators. Colonial authorities had powerful institutional incentives to prevent such revelations, as they would threaten the entire foundation of Belgian rule in the Congo. This created a structural bias toward cover-up and denial that operated independently of the personal motivations or moral character of individual investigators. Part 6.
credibility, and final resolution. The truth about what happened at Vandenbroeck Plantation during the rainy season of 1924 would remain hidden for nearly 4 decades, buried beneath layers of colonial bureaucracy, official denials, and the systematic silencing of African voices who possessed first-hand knowledge of the events. The investigation conducted by Captain André Dubois concluded that Henri and Philippe Vandenbroeck had fallen victim to a coordinated attack by wild animals, possibly driven to unusual aggression by environmental factors associated with the unusually heavy rains that had flooded large sections of the Congo Basin that year. The official report, filed in the Colonial Archives in Léopoldville on June 15, 1924, described the discovery of the Vandenbroeck's remains in a state that made precise determination of cause of death impossible. According to Dubois' account, the bodies showed extensive trauma consistent with attacks by large predators, possibly leopards or wild dogs, that had been driven to unusual aggression by environmental factors associated with the unusually heavy rains.
From their normal territories by flooding, the plantation's hunting dogs were found dead in their kennels, apparently poisoned by contaminated meat, eliminating the primary security system that might have prevented such an attack. Leon Mercier, the overseer, had reportedly fled the plantation during the initial chaos, taking with him substantial sums of money from the plantation's safe. His subsequent disappearance was attributed to his involvement in the theft, with colonial authorities issuing warrants for his arrest on charges of embezzlement and abandonment of duty. No trace of Mercier was ever found, despite extensive searches conducted by colonial police throughout the region. The surviving workers at Vandenbroeck Plantation provided testimony that supported the official narrative of animal attack and subsequent panic. They described hearing unusual sounds from the forest during the night, followed by the discovery of the bodies and evidence of Mercier's hasty departure. Their accounts were consistent and detailed, providing investigators with a clear timeline of events that supported the conclusion of death by misadventure rather than human agency. Bakari Mwanza, in his capacity as keeper of the hunting dogs, provided crucial testimony about the animals' unusual behavior in the days preceding the attack. He described how the dogs had become increasingly agitated and aggressive, possibly in response to the presence of wild predators in the area. His explanation of the dogs' deaths focused on their consumption of contaminated bushmeat, a common hazard during periods of heavy rain, when normal food sources became scarce and hunting became more dangerous. The plantation itself was sold at auction 3 months later to a consortium of Belgian investors who implemented significant changes in management practices. The new owners eliminated the use of hunting dogs for worker control, citing both the expense and the potential dangers revealed by the Vandenbroeck incident. They also instituted policies that provided better living conditions and more humane treatment for workers, changes that were attributed to lessons learned from the tragic events of 1924. Kibonge Lomami, who had served as Bakari's primary accomplice in the carefully orchestrated plan, received appointment as head of the new work crews under the reformed management system. His detailed knowledge of plantation operations and his apparent loyalty to the colonial system made him a valuable asset to the new owners. He would remain in this position for nearly 2 decades, eventually retiring to a small farm purchased with his accumulated savings. The broader implications of the Vandenbroeck incident rippled throughout the colonial administration in ways that were never explicitly acknowledged in official communications. Other plantation owners in the region quietly implemented changes in their security arrangements and worker management policies, reducing their reliance on brutal intimidation tactics while increasing their investment in surveillance and information gathering systems. Colonial authorities in Léopoldville commissioned a comprehensive review of security procedures at remote plantations, resulting in new regulations that required more frequent inspections and improved communication systems. These changes were presented as administrative efficiency measures rather than responses to the specific events at Vandenbroeck Plantation, maintaining the fiction that the incident had been an unfortunate accident rather than a carefully planned act of resistance.
The investigation revealed several systematic weaknesses in colonial oversight that had contributed to the tragedy. The isolation of remote plantations had prevented rapid response to the crisis, while inadequate communication systems had delayed the arrival of assistance. Poor record-keeping practices had made it difficult to establish accurate timelines or verify the testimony of witnesses, creating uncertainties that complicated the investigation process. Dr. François Lemaire, the colonial medical officer who conducted the examination of the remains, noted in his report that the extensive trauma made definitive determination of cause of death impossible using available forensic techniques. His findings supported the conclusion that the victims had been killed by animal attack, while acknowledging that the condition of the bodies prevented more detailed analysis of the specific circumstances surrounding their deaths. The financial investigation conducted by colonial auditors revealed significant irregularities in the plantation's accounting systems, including evidence of systematic embezzlement by Mercier over a period of several years. These discoveries provided additional support for the official narrative that attributed the overseer's disappearance to his involvement in financial crimes, rather than his potential victimization by the same forces that had killed the Vandenbroecks. Thomas Banza, the local tracker employed by the investigation, provided detailed analysis of the physical evidence found at the scene. His report described tracks and signs consistent with the presence of large predators in the area, while noting the absence of evidence that would suggest human involvement in the attacks. His expertise in reading forest signs was considered authoritative by colonial officials, lending credibility to the animal attack hypothesis. The missionary station at San Gabriel, located approximately 20 kilometers from the plantation, reported unusual activity in the forest during the period surrounding the incident. Father Michel Dubont noted increased movement of wildlife and several nights of unusual sounds that had disturbed the sleep of mission residents. These observations were incorporated into the official report as supporting evidence for the environmental disruption theory. The river transport companies that serviced the plantation reported no unusual cargo shipments or passenger movements during the relevant time period, supporting the conclusion that outside agitators had not been involved in the incident. Captain Jan Verhoeven of the river steamer Léopold noted that his regular supply delivery to the plantation had proceeded normally 2 weeks before the tragedy, with no indication of unusual tensions or security concerns. The indigenous communities in the surrounding area provided testimony through appointed headmen about their observations during the period in question. Chief Nkusu of the Mongo settlement at Mbandaka described increased predator activity and several livestock attacks that had occurred in the weeks preceding the plantation incident. These reports supported the theory that environmental factors had driven dangerous animals to unusual levels of aggression. Mama Beatrice, the plantation cook who had survived the incident, provided detailed testimony about the family's final days and the growing sense of unease that had pervaded the compound. Her account described Henri Vandenbroeck's increasing paranoia about security threats and his decision to implement additional precautions that had proven inadequate against the eventual attack. Her survival was attributed to her residence in the kitchen quarters, which were located at sufficient distance from the main house to escape the predator's attention. The Colonial Postal Service reported no unusual correspondence from Vandenbroeck Plantation in the weeks preceding the incident, indicating that the victims had not sought assistance or reported threats to outside authorities. This absence of warning communications supported the conclusion that the attack had been sudden and unexpected, rather than the culmination of an escalating conflict. The weather records maintained by the Colonial Meteorological Service documented the exceptional rainfall that had characterized the 1924 rainy season, providing scientific support for theories about environmental disruption and animal behavior modification. Station Chief Pierre Lebrun noted that precipitation levels had exceeded historical averages by more than 40%, creating conditions that would have significantly altered normal ecological patterns. Marie-Claire Vandenbroeck, who had been visiting friends in Léopoldville during the incident, inherited the family's remaining assets and chose to return to Belgium rather than continue involvement in colonial agriculture. Her departure eliminated the last direct connection between the Vandenbroeck family and the plantation, allowing the new owners to implement their reforms without interference from previous management practices. The regional force publique commander, Major Paul Delacroix, conducted a comprehensive security assessment that identified multiple vulnerabilities in the plantation's defensive arrangements. His recommendations led to new colonial policies requiring improved perimeter security and emergency communication systems at remote facilities. These measures were implemented throughout the region as standard administrative improvements rather than responses to specific security incidents. The case files related to the Vandenbroeck investigation were classified as confidential and stored in the colonial archives, where they remained unavailable to independent researchers for decades. The official policy of treating the incident as a tragic accident rather than a security breach meant that detailed information about the investigation was not widely disseminated, preventing the development of alternative theories about what had actually occurred. The workers who had been employed at Vandenbroeck Plantation were redistributed among other agricultural facilities in the region, with colonial authorities ensuring that they were separated to prevent the formation of coordinated groups that might perpetuate dangerous ideas about resistance or rebellion. This dispersion was presented as an administrative convenience rather than a security measure, maintaining the fiction that the workers had been innocent victims rather than potential participants in the events. Bakari Mwanza was assigned to work at a palm oil processing facility near Bumba, where his experience with animal care made him valuable for maintaining the oxen and horses used in transportation operations. His exemplary service record and apparent loyalty to colonial authority made him a model worker in the eyes of his new supervisors, who had no knowledge of his previous activities or his role in the Vandenbroeck incident. The financial compensation provided to the workers for their losses in the incident was distributed through colonial welfare programs that emphasized the benevolent care provided by Belgian administration for African victims of tragedy. These payments were carefully documented as evidence of colonial humanitarian concerns, while the recipients were required to sign agreements acknowledging their satisfaction with the official investigation and their lack of additional claims against the government. The medical examination of surviving workers revealed no evidence of unusual injuries or trauma that would suggest their involvement in violent conflict. Dr. Lemaire's health assessments documented minor injuries and ailments consistent with normal plantation labor, supporting the narrative that the workers had been uninvolved bystanders who had simply discovered the aftermath of the animal attack. The architectural modifications implemented at other plantations in response to the Vandenbroeck incident included improved lighting systems, reinforced sleeping quarters, and enhanced barrier systems designed to prevent animal intrusion. These changes were presented as logical safety improvements rather than responses to security threats, maintaining the official position that better preparation could have prevented the tragic accident. The truth about Bakari's carefully orchestrated plan would not emerge until the late 1950s, when aging survivors began sharing their memories with family members and community leaders who had gained sufficient distance from colonial authority to speak more freely. These accounts described in detail the months of preparation, the careful conditioning of the hunting dogs, the precise timing of the execution, and the systematic elimination of evidence that had made the plan successful. The testimonies revealed how Bakari had used his intimate knowledge of animal behavior to turn the plantation's own security systems against their creators. The hunting dogs had been gradually conditioned to associate the scents and sounds of their masters with food rewards, creating behavioral modifications that could be triggered at precisely chosen moments. The apparent poisoning of the dogs had actually been their elimination as witnesses, preventing any possibility that their unusual behavior might be detected during the investigation. Kibonge Lomami, speaking to his grandchildren in the early 1960s, described the careful coordination required to maintain the deception during the colonial investigation. Every surviving worker understood their role in protecting the secret, providing consistent testimony that supported the official narrative while concealing the true nature of what had occurred. Their success had depended not only on careful preparation, but on the colonial investigators' fundamental assumptions about African capabilities and their unwillingness to consider the possibility of such sophisticated planning. The revelation of these long-hidden truths provided a different perspective on colonial resistance, demonstrating that African opposition to European domination had often taken forms that were invisible to the authorities. Rather than open rebellion or violent confrontation, resistance had frequently operated through patience, intelligence, and the careful exploitation
of colonial blindness to African agency and capability. The legacy of Bakari Mwanza became a source of pride and inspiration for communities throughout the region, representing proof that even the most oppressive systems contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those who possessed the courage and intelligence to identify them. His story became part of the oral tradition that preserved African perspectives on colonial experience, providing an alternative narrative to the official histories that had been written by the colonizers themselves. The transformation of the Congo Basin into an industrial resource extraction zone had accelerated dramatically in the decade following the end of the Great War, driven by European demand for raw materials needed to rebuild devastated economies and fuel the growing automotive industry. The rubber plantations that dotted the landscape along major river systems represented the cutting edge of colonial capitalism, designed to maximize extraction efficiency while minimizing operational costs through the systematic exploitation of indigenous labor and environmental resources. The economic model that governed operations like the Vandenbroeck Plantation was built on principles that would have been immediately recognizable to the architects of the Atlantic slave trade centuries earlier. Human beings were treated as capital investments whose value lay entirely in their productive capacity, while their welfare, cultural integrity, and basic survival needs were considered relevant only insofar as they affected output levels. The financial calculations that determined working conditions, living standards, and punishment policies were based solely on cost-benefit analyses that assigned no intrinsic worth to African lives. The global rubber market that provided the ultimate destination for latex produced at plantations throughout the Congo operated according to commodity trading principles that completely divorced the end product from the human costs of its production. European and American consumers who purchased automobile tires, industrial gaskets, and waterproof clothing manufactured from Congo rubber remained entirely ignorant of the brutal conditions under which the raw materials had been extracted. This deliberate separation of production and consumption allowed industrial societies to benefit from colonial exploitation while maintaining the comfortable fiction that their prosperity was built on legitimate commercial relationships rather than systematic violence. The financial institutions that provided capital for plantation development and expansion were equally insulated from direct exposure to the methods used to generate their returns on investment. Belgian banks that financed operations like Vandenbroeck's required detailed reports on productivity levels, profit margins, and market projections, but actively discouraged information about labor practices or worker welfare that might complicate their legal position or moral comfort. The regulatory frameworks governing international investment were designed to protect capital rather than workers, creating powerful incentives for the systematic concealment of abuse.
The technological infrastructure that supported colonial extraction was itself a product of careful calculation about the minimum investment required to maintain profitable operations. Communication systems were designed to facilitate command and control rather than information sharing or accountability. Transportation networks prioritized the efficient movement of extracted resources rather than the mobility or welfare of local populations. Medical facilities focused on maintaining worker productivity rather than promoting general health or addressing systemic causes of illness and injury. The educational policies implemented throughout the Belgian Congo reflected deliberate decisions to limit African intellectual development to the narrow skills required for specific industrial tasks. The colonial administration had concluded that widespread literacy or technical education would create dangerous expectations among the African population, while providing no corresponding benefits to European economic interests. The result was a systematic program of intellectual stunting designed to maintain cognitive dependency and prevent the development of analytical capabilities that might threaten colonial authority. The legal framework that governed labor relations on plantations like Vandenbroeck's had been carefully crafted to provide maximum flexibility for employers while offering virtually no protections for workers. Contracts were written in languages that workers could not read, contained provisions that workers could not understand, and could be modified unilaterally by employers without notification or compensation. The colonial court system that ostensibly provided legal recourse for grievances was staffed entirely by Europeans whose careers depended on maintaining good relationships with the business community. The military and police forces responsible for maintaining order in rural areas operated under doctrines that explicitly prioritized the protection of European economic interests over the enforcement of even minimal standards of human treatment. The Force Publique, which served as the primary security organization throughout the colony, had been trained and equipped specifically for the suppression of African resistance rather than the investigation and prosecution of European crimes. Local police units were subordinated to this military structure and received clear instructions that labor discipline took precedence over individual rights or community welfare. The medical establishment that provided healthcare services in colonial areas functioned according to policies that reflected the fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy that underpinned the entire system. European personnel received comprehensive medical care designed to maintain their health and comfort in challenging tropical conditions, while African workers had access only to basic emergency treatment focused on maintaining their ability to perform assigned tasks. Chronic conditions, mental health issues, and long-term disabilities among African workers were viewed as acceptable costs of efficient resource extraction rather than problems requiring systematic attention. The religious institutions that operated in colonial areas served primarily as instruments of social control rather than sources of spiritual guidance or moral authority. Missionary activities were carefully monitored and regulated to ensure that religious instruction emphasized obedience to secular authority rather than concepts of universal human dignity or social justice. The Christianity that was taught to African converts had been stripped of its more radical implications and reduced to a system of behavioral rules designed to produce compliant and obedient subjects.
Workers, rather than empowered believers. The international diplomatic framework within which colonial exploitation operated provided additional layers of protection for European interests through the systematic exclusion of African voices from global discussions of colonial policy. International conferences and treaty negotiations concerning African territories were conducted exclusively among European powers, with no representation or consideration of indigenous interests.
The League of Nations and other international organizations that ostensibly promoted global cooperation operated according to principles of trusteeship that legitimized European control, while imposing only minimal and largely unenforced obligations for African welfare. The scientific and academic institutions that studied colonial societies and economies functioned primarily as sources of legitimization for existing policies, rather than independent sources of critical analysis. Anthropological research was designed to document African cultural practices that could be cited as evidence of primitive development, requiring European guidance, while economic studies focused on maximizing extraction efficiency rather than assessing social costs or environmental sustainability. The knowledge produced by these institutions was used to refine methods of control and exploitation rather than to question their fundamental assumptions or moral foundations. The media and publication systems that shaped European public understanding of colonial affairs operated according to editorial policies that emphasized the civilizing mission of colonial powers, while systematically suppressing information about systematic abuse or resistance activities. Newspapers and magazines published in Europe presented colonial plantations as examples of successful development that brought progress and prosperity to backward regions, while avoiding detailed examination of the methods used to achieve those results. The result was a systematic program of public deception that maintained popular support for colonial policies by concealing their true nature and consequences. The economic theories that provided intellectual justification for colonial exploitation drew heavily on racial ideologies that portrayed Africans as inherently suited for manual labor under European supervision. These theories treated the extraction of wealth from African resources as a natural and beneficial process that brought civilization and development to regions that would otherwise remain stagnant and unproductive. The academic disciplines that studied economic development operated according to assumptions that made systematic exploitation invisible by defining it as legitimate market activity. The cultural institutions that shaped European attitudes toward Africa and Africans functioned as sophisticated propaganda systems that maintained popular support for colonial policies through the systematic promotion of racist stereotypes and justifications. Museums displayed African artifacts in ways that emphasized primitive development and cultural inferiority, while popular literature and entertainment presented Africans as either dangerous savages requiring control or grateful recipients of European benevolence. These cultural productions created powerful psychological barriers to accurate understanding of colonial realities, while providing emotional satisfaction for European audiences who preferred to view themselves as civilizing benefactors rather than exploitative oppressors. The environmental consequences of intensive plantation agriculture were beginning to become apparent by the 1920s, but were systematically ignored or minimized by colonial authorities whose planning horizons were determined by immediate profit requirements rather than long-term sustainability concerns. The destruction of natural ecosystems, the depletion of soil fertility, and the disruption of traditional agricultural practices created mounting pressures that would eventually undermine the economic foundations of colonial exploitation. But these problems were treated as externalities rather than central features of the developmental model. The social disintegration caused by colonial labor policies was similarly ignored or dismissed as an inevitable cost of modernization, rather than a predictable consequence of systematic family separation and community destruction. The colonial administration maintained detailed statistics on productivity levels and financial returns, while remaining deliberately ignorant of the psychological trauma, cultural loss, and social breakdown that resulted from their policies. The human costs of colonial development were literally uncountable within the frameworks used to evaluate policy success. The resistance networks that were developing throughout the Congo represented a sophisticated response to colonial oppression that drew on traditional forms of organization while adapting to the specific challenges posed by European technology and administrative systems. These networks operated through kinship connections, trading relationships, and religious affiliations that remained largely invisible to colonial authorities who understood neither their organizational principles nor their strategic capabilities. The colonial administration's focus on preventing open rebellion blinded them to the far more dangerous development of systematic underground opposition. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of colonial security forces were limited by their fundamental misunderstanding of African social organization and communication systems. European officials consistently underestimated the sophistication of indigenous information networks while overestimating their own ability to monitor and control African activities. The result was a systematic intelligence failure that left colonial authorities vulnerable to forms of resistance that operated outside their conceptual frameworks and beyond their surveillance capabilities. The economic pressures that drove increasingly brutal exploitation were also creating contradictions within the colonial system that would eventually contribute to its downfall. The destruction of African communities and the brutalization of workers were beginning to interfere with long-term productivity as death rates increased and the available labor force declined. The short-term focus on maximum extraction was undermining the social and environmental foundations that made continued exploitation possible. The international context within which colonial exploitation operated was beginning to change in ways that would eventually challenge European dominance, but these shifts remained largely invisible to colonial administrators, whose attention was focused on immediate operational concerns. The development of anti-colonial movements in other parts of the world, the growing international attention to human rights issues, and the emergence of new forms of global communication
were creating pressures that would eventually force fundamental changes in colonial policies. The psychological impact of systematic brutalization on both victims and perpetrators was creating long-term social problems that would persist far beyond the end of formal colonial rule. The trauma inflicted on African communities would affect generations of families, while the moral corruption of European administrators would contribute to broader social problems in metropolitan societies. The colonial system was creating damaged human beings on both sides of the racial divide, though the suffering was distributed in radically unequal ways. The resistance, exemplified by figures like Bakari Mwanza, represented more than individual acts of vengeance or desperate attempts at escape. It constituted part of a broader pattern of African agency and intelligence that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and colonial legitimacy. The success of carefully planned acts of resistance demonstrated that European control was far more fragile than its beneficiaries understood, and that African capabilities were far greater than colonial ideologies acknowledged. The investigation frameworks that would be applied to incidents like those at Vandenbroeck Plantation were themselves products of the same racist assumptions and institutional biases that had made such incidents inevitable. Colonial investigators brought to their work preconceptions about African inferiority and European authority that made accurate fact-finding nearly impossible, while the legal and administrative systems within which they operated provided powerful incentives for cover-up and denial rather than truth-telling and accountability. The broader historical trajectory that would eventually lead to the end of colonial rule was already being shaped by resistance activities like those organized by Bakari, though the connections would only become apparent decades later. Each successful act of resistance contributed to the accumulation of knowledge and experience that would eventually make larger-scale liberation movements possible, while demonstrating to both oppressors and oppressed that European power was not invulnerable. The legacy of colonial exploitation would persist long after formal independence, embedded in economic structures, political institutions, and cultural attitudes that continued to shape relationships between Europe and Africa. The brutal realities of places like Vandenbroeck Plantation would be largely forgotten in official histories,
but would survive in oral traditions and family memories that preserved alternative narratives of resistance and survival. The moral accounting for colonial crimes would remain largely incomplete, with the beneficiaries of exploitation successfully avoiding responsibility for the systematic violence that had generated their wealth. The international community would eventually develop human rights frameworks and legal mechanisms designed to prevent similar atrocities, but these would prove inadequate to address the continuing legacies of colonial exploitation or to prevent new forms of systematic oppression.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.